Experten von GLOBArt und von uns gebeten, diesen Reality-Check zu machen. Professor Dr. Peter Parycek ist genau an der Schnittstelle zwischen dem Aral Balkan und der Herzog. Er leitet an der Donau-Universität Krems das Department für E-Governance, Wirtschaft und Verwaltung und ist für mich so jemand wie der Prophet im eigenen Land, weil er auf eine sehr mutige Art und Weise nicht, und diese Berufungen hatte er auch, ins Ausland gegangen ist, sondern in Österreich geblieben ist und geschafft hat, wirklich, und sich nicht nur auf die Fahnen zu heften, sondern wirklich mit seinem Institut inter- und transdisziplinär zu forschen. Und das hat einerseits revolutionäre Ergebnisse zur Folge, was den Inhalt betrifft, aber hat auch zur Folge, dass man sich viel mit Bürokratie und mit den Hürden in Österreich herumschlagen muss. Aber er ist für mich so etwas wie die Idealbesetzung zwischen Aral und Lisa. Begrüßen Sie mit mir Peter Parycek.
That was a great talk. Would you like some water?
Oh, thanks.
Okay.
Two really great talks. So thanks for your two talks.
This is good. Gassy.
Yeah. So let's try to build some bridges. Let me start with the first question to you. You ended your talk. You finished your talk with the question, how could we democratize economy? And I asked myself, how would you achieve that? It's more a bottom-up approach, or is it more a top-down approach? What ideas do you have to? How could we do that?
Well, I guess in the end it needs to be both. But the situation we are in right now is such that there's, I think, path dependency, that in a capitalist society it's just easier to start capitalist enterprises like startups. And there's all the infrastructure that we have in order to build new things of the same kind, basically, just because, you know, there are manuals of how to do it. And what we need at this point in time, I think, are alternative models. And I think what you need right now is two things: bottom-up experimentation with other models and research on existing models that like cooperatives, Mondragon, all these cases, to understand what the obstacles are. And what we often see is that more democratic enterprises work on a small scale, but we need to understand the upscaling process, how we can create bigger and yet democratic companies. And there are also many questions about, okay, who's supposed to be included? Is it just the employees? Is it users, like in internet companies? Is it other stakeholders? So experimentation, bottom up. And then when we have a better understanding, we also need top-down changes in the legislation that create a level playing field so that there isn't this, you know, bias against democratic enterprises.
So you mentioned Mondragon. Maybe it's not so. Not all people are common with this example, because I also ask very often myself, why do not other companies copy the model of Mondragon? Because it's so successful, and there's still just one Mondragon. Do you have an explanation for that?
No, and I'm not an expert on Mondragon, unfortunately. I'd like to be. But one thing that I happen to know and that I find very interesting is that, well, two things actually. Mondragon was not founded by someone who was into it just for the money. It was started by a priest in fascist Spain, actually, in a situation in which there was high unemployment and lots of social trouble, and he wanted to do something to get people on board. So it had this communal spirit from the start. And then what I also heard is that often you have problems about handing over to the next generation. And so they had a very intense process of passing on the ideas, the spirit to the next generation. And I think those are two very interesting points that we might also need for other more democratic enterprises. Have a founder who's not just in for the money, and find mechanisms of passing on the spirit to the next generations.
And they stick to some basic principles,
yeah,
which they didn't change. Maybe just one sentence to this company. It's a company in Baskenland, and it's a cooperative corporation. So it's owned by the people, and it's not a small company. It's in the meantime.
It's actually a conglomerate of companies. They have a bank. They produce fridges, I think. So it's quite broad. I don't know the up-to-date numbers, but it's not just a tiny 5-person enterprise. It's like Siemens or all the other big enterprises. So it can be done. So that's so fascinating about it.
And in the meantime, worldwide. So it's they breached out from the Baskenland. My bridge to your talk was you mentioned they could bottom-up movements, and so I thought about startups. Because if you look into startups, it's a great working. It's great to work in a startup very often.
If you're a white man, usually, yes, it's what we most have.
You're working on the same eye level. It's a community.
White men,
it's driven by high energy.
Testosterone.
Everyone has a word. So that reminds me very much. Maybe startups. These would be a possibility, and then it continued. If you look to the big companies at the moment, they have huge problems because they are too slow. You mentioned often that something it's too complex to be solved by one hierarchical company, and I think also they are too slow to solve to solve problems, and they're also too slow in their innovation processes, and this is one of the reasons why they very often try to copy startups. Did you have a look at these kind of elements which are crucial in this area?
Well, I don't have a crutch against the term startups, but I see exactly what you mean, because so there's, one thing is to start something new because you think there's genuine value for your customers, you can also benefit yourself, and this is something that has a future, and you want to do it in the long run. And then there's this other model where you just try to do something in order to be bought by a big company. And I think this is actually pretty toxic, because what I see at universities is that when young people are taught about startups, it's always with the aim of doing something that's scalable. And not all good ideas are scalable. I mean, there are lots of good ideas that are scalable, but we also need non-scalable, just ordinary businesses. So there's this strong focus on do something in order to be bought by Google. And I think this completely directs human capital, ideas, creativity in the wrong direction. And it's just a waste of talent and energy, I think. So nothing wrong with startups I think what you mean by startups is just what I meant by having genuine value creation. I think maybe we need to talk about what values are. We just focus on the money, and this is often distorted by the whole system that's around it. That's one of the fundamental questions here.
These are so you mentioned two of the terms which are very heavily used in Silicon Valley. So one is scalability and exit. And exit is when you have reached the goal that Google is buying you or Facebook is buying your startup. And maybe this is the reason why there is a very negative connotation to startup, because it's connected to scalability and exit. But that's not always the reason. So if you look to startups in Berlin or Vienna, there are also different possibilities of culture within a startup, especially if you look to Berlin.
I think that's exactly the point that I was addressing. So many different types of organizations, especially in Europe, call themselves startups because it's a sexy term in a sense, right? And because it's got a lot of marketing behind it, lots of budget behind it. But what they have to understand, that if they're not a real startup, if they haven't gotten venture capital to begin with, and if they're actually providing a service or a product and they're charging people money for it, if there is a real startup that enters their field, they will disrupt them. What that means is that a Silicon Valley startup will come to offer the same service that they're offering, the same product that they're offering at zero cost, right? Because they have the venture capital. They're a real startup. You're saying you're a startup, but you're actually not. You're doing a lot of social good. You're actually empowering people. You are so much better than a startup. But then a real startup comes and says, hey, we're a startup just like them. You love them, right? They do great stuff, and you pay for it. You love them so much. We're going to do what they're doing, but we're going to do it for free. They go out of business because you can't compete with free. When they've gone out of business, Google buys them or they IPO.
Exactly.
This is why it's so key that we don't use startup.
Conceptual corruption, you might
Well,
say.
if we're not a startup, then we will be put out of business by startups. So why are we perpetuating their brand?
So this is your main argument. Your main argument.
My
So-
main argument, I think, is that human beings deserve to live with dignity, and we can do much better than what we're doing right now. But yes.
Linked to the startup discussion. So it's not about creating a company. It's about the financing.
It's already been sold.
Yeah.
If you take venture capital, and that was my point, it's already been sold. We don't then think, will there be an exit? Will they sell us? They already did. So let's stop being shocked every time we get disappointed 5 years later by our latest social network or our latest free product that we're using when Google buys it. Google might be buying Twitter now, for example. Let's stop getting shocked at least, because we knew that was what it was from the very beginning.
Absolutely. Yeah, that that brings me to one of your core ideas, and that was the discussion about data. Data is oil. Data can't be oil because then we only could use it once.
Well, maybe
But,
data
yeah.
about rocks could be oil, you know, but not people.
Because we could use data again and again. So I think this is one of the reasons why I don't like the picture of data is oil. And you talked a lot about humans. Data from humans is people. I think that was the strongest point. But you didn't mention why do they do that? So why is Google collecting, why is Facebook collecting so much data?
So let me tell you this. If I know everything about you, and I'm constantly psychoanalyzing you, I have experts who are psychoanalyzing your behavior, so I can start to predict how you will behave. I can start to predict what you like, what you don't like. I have a very good idea of whether you are having an affair. I have a very good idea of where you live, where you work, what your beliefs are. I can use that to manipulate you for various reasons, perhaps the most transparent of which is to get your money, right? So what does it mean if we create a society where corporations and governments know everything about us and we know nothing about them? So that's the core issue here. When we talk about privacy, privacy is not some abstract concept. It's about power relationships. That's why individuals, human beings, have a human right to privacy, and corporations and governments should be transparent because they already have so much more power and wealth than we do. Privacy is the means by which we try and even that playing field. But of course, today we live in an upside-down world where corporations and governments have a right to privacy, and we don't. So Google, when I buy their Nest camera, can watch what I do in my home, for example. But if I walk into Google's offices with a camcorder, I will get arrested.
They kick you out.
Yes.
Yeah. Even if you use their bikes.
Even if you do.
Yeah. Maybe just one of the main reasons why they are doing it at the moment. So just this is more a look maybe into the future. At the moment, they are trying to build the profiles because they are selling ads.
Yes.
So Facebook and Google are advertisement companies, and so this is the reason why they try to build the perfect profiles about me, about you, so that they can provide us the perfect ad. Google is only earning money when we click the advertisement. And that's the reason why they are so heavily searching and collecting data and building profiles, like you mentioned it. So at the moment, it's a very business-driven idea why they built this profile, because otherwise they would not be able to finance all the other activities which they're doing. And Facebook is very similar. Facebook is earning, I think 90% of their profit is connected with selling ads to other companies. So at the moment, in my perspective, it's a business-driven idea why they are collecting data. And I also think that we will not be in a position to change that. I think all the companies will continue to collect data. The public will continue to collect data. And what I missed in your brilliant talk is to talk about the data, how they are allowed to use the data. So because the data analytics, that could lead to I think to a real problem in the very near future. Because if you use the data, the inequality in the society could increase dramatically. If you just look to the health sector, health insurances, for example, or any kind of insurances or financing systems, because when they are starting to build profiles, they know exactly, maybe better than us, when we will die, what kind of health problems we will issue in the next years, and so on and so on. And this leads to a system where the society breaks into different pieces. And maybe we could have a short discussion about that problem, because that could lead to the end to the society how we know it today.
Well, I mean, can I just expand upon one of your core positions on that? Of course, Google and Facebook are collecting data today because there is a huge business case, but that's not the only reason. If you look at who Eric Schmidt co-authored his book with, it was Jared Cohen. If you look at who's on the board of Dropbox, it's Condoleezza Rice. So we are talking not just about a business imperative, we're talking about a neoliberal view of the world. And when I talk to Eric, I don't see someone who wants to make more money. When you talk to Eric, you see someone who wants power and who wants political control as well, because that's what you want when you have a few billion in your personal bank account going forward. So I think it is to some degree ever so slightly naive to think that this is just an objective business purpose behind it. What we're talking about is the creation of monopolies so powerful that some of them have cash reserves that are greater than the GDPs of certain nations, that are not bound by national borders, and in some ways probably have more political power than more nations. So and are currently lobbying to have even more of that with the trade deals that we're seeing. So this is definitely not just about giving you email. We're not heading towards it. We're not sleepwalking into something. We are there. We live in an era right now, not of democracy, but of corporate control. And we do have a chance to veer away from it. We can build these alternatives that I talked about, because there's nothing in the technology that says that one corporation has to know all of this information. So what you said about, what if we limit how they can use it? I think that's a very important thing to do in the short term. I think that's how we should be regulating as part of our regulations. Yes, to say, you say you want to provide an email service, so you need this information. The moment you don't need that information, you need to delete it, right? And do you know how they will fight that? When I was talking to Eric, about, I think it was a year or two ago now in London, he said, I wake up every morning, this is Eric Schmidt, he said, I wake up every morning and I fight regulation. That is what I do. That is my job. And he said also, because I said, where's this leading? He said, well, if we become too evil, we won't find people to work for us, which I thought was a very naive statement there, but what he meant was we won't find the best people to work for us. And maybe this is the one way that we fight this now. We make it socially unacceptable. We did this with tobacco. When tobacco became socially unacceptable, then it was easier to regulate. When people start thinking of Google as they think of Philip Morris today, then we will be on the path to changing it. And we need those alternatives then.
I think Eric Schmidt also has a second example from the history in his mind, and this is Bell. Bell was a very huge telecom provider in the United States, and it was a monopoly. So they destroyed the monopoly. And I think they learned from the history, and this is also the reason why they are lobbying on such
Yes,
high
exactly.
scale.
And
so
it's not Google anymore, it's Alphabet.
Yeah.
I mean, they have made their vision clear. They want to own the alphabet. Yeah. They're not even hiding it. Yeah. I'm sorry, Lisa.
So I fully agree with this problem. And, it's sort of ironic that we have those feudal structures in the name of the free market, because if you actually look at the text by Adam Smith, which I did in the past, you see that he's writing exactly against this kind of thing, where you have the combination of economic and political power through the money bridge, and those people who are in power use their economic power in order to get the political framework to be set in ways that keeps them in power. So it's a self-reinforcing circle. But I think what you were alluding to is an even broader issue, because I mean, there are not only online corporations, there are also financial corporations, oil, whatever. And what we're talking about, I took it, was really the question of whether we can keep up the social contract in a world that is dominated by structures that reinforce inequalities. And let me give you just a short example, because I looked at this in detail. So this is the American market for private debt. If you are a middle class, preferably white, normal double-income family in the US, getting credit is terribly easy. You can get a loan to buy a house, you can get mortgages, whatever. So the possibility of going into debt increases your freedoms because you can change your budget constraints over time. So it's a good thing. But if you are a poor American, and maybe you're non-white, maybe you're a single mother, whatever, the way in which the debt market works is that it's super likely that you'll fall into a debt trap where you pay higher rates, you have to resolve the loans again and again and again, you go to payday lenders, and you end up going bankrupt. And so there's not a level playing field in these markets, but rather, if you're already in a comfortable position, it offers opportunities. If you're in a disadvantaged positions, it's very likely that you will be exploited and you fall into this trap and you never get out of it. And why am I mentioning this? I'm mentioning this because I think this is the kind of structure that we see in lots of different places. So you have an unequal society, because let's face it, our societies are unequal. And I mean, not all of them are equally unequal, but all of them have some inequality. And if we have an unequal background, certain mechanisms in free markets, in online services, whatever, tend to reinforce these structures in a way that is contrary to all our ideas about equality and freedom and dignity and so on. And it also really threatens the social contract. We don't live in the same kinds of societies anymore. If you are, as I said, in a comfortable position, you can buy privacy. You can take all the measures it takes. Privacy has become a luxury good, if you like.
Always was.
Always was, but now even more in the online sphere. You can get the services and the system work for you and your family and your kids. But if you're disadvantaged, it looks more and more like these things are all working against you. And this is toxic for social cohesion. So these structural mechanisms are really important to understand and to analyze and to take political measures against them as far as we still can.
And Lisa, have you actually heard about the Facebook patent for affecting your credit score based on your social network on Facebook? So if your friends on on Facebook are rich, then your credit will be fine. If, however, you have some undesirables, I guess, according to their criteria as your friends, then you might not be able to get credit. In fact, in China, they're putting this into effect in the whole country now with a program called Open Sesame, I think, or just Sesame, where you will have a citizen score, which is a social score. And that will be based on everything you do online, everything that you post, the content of it, whether it's in line with the government's wishes or not. And that will determine what perks you get and what perks you don't. So China's already putting it into effect. Facebook just has a patent on it for now, and they're waiting to see how things go.
And we think of our societies as still being more or less democratic, but I mean, China isn't. And imagine our societies falling into the hands of certain not so democratic figures. And I mean, this is not just a fantasy now in the US.
So in data analytics in general, this was a Facebook example, but data analytics in general accelerates the inequality process. And the process which forces inequality.
I mean,
yeah.
I think one thing that we have to stop.
Just give me a second.
Okay. Sorry.
Ist es das an? Danke. Es ist meine Aufgabe, auf die Zeit zu schauen, und ich versuche die ganze Zeit in die Gesichter zu blicken und alle starren noch nach vorne. Ich wage jetzt ein Experiment. Ja. Ich lasse Sie abstimmen. Ja. Es ist nicht gegen die Referenten, wenn Sie sich für die Pause entscheiden. Aber mein Vorschlag wäre, wollen Sie noch 10 Minuten mehr Diskussion und dann 20 Minuten Pause, oder wollen Sie jetzt in die Pause? Wir sprechen über Selbstverantwortung, wir probieren das jetzt. Wer ist für weitere 10 Minuten Diskussion? Gegenstimmen, wer ist für Pause? Gut. Wollen Sie drei einfach in die Pause gehen, beziehungsweise wenn jemand Yoga machen will, wir bieten nämlich das Ganzheitliche hier an und ein bisschen die Alternative zu Kopf, dann verlassen Sie einfach bitte und nehmen Sie sich die Pause, ansonsten geht es noch 10 Minuten weiter. Danke.
Okay.
10 minutes. Okay. Yeah, you mentioned, and we could delete, or the company should delete the email. And
Well, not delete not if we don't want them to, of course.
yeah, of
but
course,
yes.
yeah. But if we want them,
Yes.
that they delete it. And the problem in all these gadget devices and also services is they are free. Or
As in cost, not freedom.
yeah,
Yes.
absolutely, because we give them. It's an exchange between service and data. So we give them our data, and we get
Right.
a free service.
Which the question is it a fair
cost-free.
exchange?
That's a question, but
Or-
it's
yeah.
human beings are very we are very convenient sometimes. So
We
Yeah.
value convenience,
Yeah.
which is why it's so important
Absolutely.
in the alternatives that we build that they are convenient,
And-
as if not more.
and we want to become very old. So so that's the reason why we start to process and collect data.
Indeed,
our
and
health
there's
data.
nothing wrong with that. And that was what I was saying in my talk. There's nothing wrong with that. We can collect as much information about ourselves as we want, as long as that information is in our individual ownership and control. We don't put the algorithms in Google. We don't put the algorithms in a computer at Facebook. We put the algorithms on your watch. We put the algorithms on your phone and on your computer. There's no technical infeasibility to doing that, and then you completely change the game.
But if you look to the current technological development, everything is in the cloud, in the
Yes.
different clouds.
Yes.
Do you really think that we can move back the data to in our more or less
Yeah.
controlled zone where we can really be the owner of the data?
I do really believe that, because I mean we've seen such social change in the past. Imagine if this was a few hundred years ago and we were having this conversation in America. There would be people saying, but we need slaves in order to be competitive in the cotton business, right? Do you think really that we could get rid of slaves and still have the businesses that we have? And the question really there is, no, we shouldn't have been doing that to begin with. I don't care how profitable it is today. It is not the right thing to be doing, and of course we can do it better.
And actually, this is a really interesting example, because before you mentioned that we need to put shame on those companies, and on the abolition of slavery, there's a very nice study by an American philosopher called Kwame Anthony Appiah, and he analyzed the transition away from slave trade and slavery. And one thing that he shows is that there was a change in the perception of what's honorable. Is it honorable to be a slave owner? And when slavery was still in place, slaves were seen as not having honor, and this is why it was perceived okay to own them, whereas you were a white, honorable person, so you could own them. But then this changed, and this took time, and this took many, many people. For example, there was a boycott of sugar by English housewives. They refused to buy sugar from slave plantations. So it was lots and lots and lots of small changes in public awareness, in the social perceptions of honor that brought about this change. And it took a few generations and a civil war. So, I mean, that's another question here, you know? How many generations and civil wars is this going
Well,
to
if
take?
anything, I think, you know, the timelines are being condensed, and in part due to the exponential rate of change in technology. And it's also why it's so essential that we change the nature of our technologies, because the relationship between societies and our social structures and technology is a feedback loop of amplification. That's what technology does. So we can't expect to keep our centralized technologies and somehow create a sustainable decentralized world where we solve things like climate change. We must also decentralize our technologies. So it's not even a question of can we do anything about it, should we do anything about it. If we don't do anything about it, it's pretty clear where we're heading. And I don't think that's in any of our interest, even if the current system might be in some of our interest in the very short term.
And we didn't mention that the boundaries between technology and human beings will also blur. So technology will sneak into our bodies, and so
Well,
so the
indeed.
task will even get tougher for all
Well,
of
it
them, and
already
more
does.
important.
There is already a Silicon Valley company in the healthcare sector that makes a pill that you swallow that actually gathers data from inside of you and shares it with the company. And the reason that they're doing that initially, the outward reason, is to make sure that you comply with the medications that you're taking. But when I asked them, it was at a meeting in London at Nesta, when I asked them, what is your business model? How do you make money? It's a very good question. Ask this of anyone you meet. How do you make money? They said, we don't know, which means they know. And then he followed it up with saying, but we think it has something to do with the data. So what data? The data from, of course, their venture capital fund, of course it does. But we don't have to ingest technology. We don't have to put it under our skin for us to be expanding and extending our biological capabilities and our abilities through technology. If we wait until all our technologies are within our skin to protect technology as part of the self, we'll be too late. We have to understand now that your phone, it might be in your pocket, but it is part of you, it is part of yourself, and must be protected as part of that self.
So the philosophical perspective here is that if something, some technology, or even pen and paper fulfill a function that is equivalent to something that you would do in your brain, some people argue it should be considered the extended brain, and they call it scaffolding. So we scaffold our human capacities, and humans have done this for ages. We've always tried to find external devices that support our bodily functions, our brain functions, and in a way, it's just nonsense to think that our brain is just inside our heads. Our brain, well, it's physically there, but what our mind is just something much broader and bigger, and what our self is, and shared
we
with
have
others.
sharded minds today, you know, and we must protect that as a whole.
And the social relations
Yeah.
within which it takes place. I mean, some philosophers hold that human beings can just be what they are because we are part of social networks, we are recognized by others, we recognize them, and we couldn't exist as humans if there wasn't this interpersonal sphere. So there is a question of what we allow to, or who we allow to intrude into this network of personal relations. And I mean, if you think about a mother and her child, or a father and his child, for example, you wouldn't want Google to come into, you know, when they're face-to-face, come in between them. But that's all of us in a way. We're all in these social relations. And we need to think about how we structure the environment within which we shape who we are.
And that's the very definition of privacy, because privacy is not about having something to hide. Privacy is having control over what you keep to yourself and what you share with others. And that is the very definition of privacy. That's where we as individuals have agency. Thank you so much. Lisa, thank you. Thank you.
Vielen, vielen Dank. Ich bitte Sie, 11:20 Uhr mit viel Disziplin, dann starten wir 5 Minuten später, aber das ist in Österreich üblich.